There is a question that stops being philosophical the moment you apply it to certain lives. Where does work end and slow destruction begin? Not a metaphor, not a thought experiment, a daily reality for hundreds of thousands of people across India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and dozens of other countries who descend into sewage systems each morning with their bare hands, no protective equipment, no safety net, and, critically, no real choice in the matter. We have a habit of reserving the word hell for abstraction. These men do not have that luxury. The profession goes by different names depending on the country, the region, the bureaucratic language of whichever government prefers not to look directly at it. But the function is the same everywhere. Human beings submerging themselves in human waste so that cities can pretend the waste does not exist, so that the infrastructure holds, so that the pipes flow, so that everyone above ground can continue their morning without interruption. What follows is 13 points. Each one removes another layer from this system, and by the time the last layer comes off, what remains is not a labour issue or a public health statistic. It is a verdict on how civilization is organised and who gets assigned to its lowest register. We begin at the surface, at the moment before the descent, when a man stands at the edge of an open manhole and makes what looks like a decision, but is not one. From there, the near-total absence of protective gear, the descent itself, and what it does to a person over time. The ecosystem waiting below, one whose continued existence functions as its own indictment. What happens after the worker climbs back out, how the mind adapts, and what it reaches for when adaptation is not enough. How the body fails, measurably, documentably, on a documented schedule. Why the economic trap closes completely and permanently. Why the state is aware and has chosen silence. How caste converts an occupation into an inheritance. And how, against every structural pressure, some of these people resist anyway. The 13th point is an introduction. The first point is a sentence passed on civilization itself. Between them is a story the world has decided, for a very long time, not to see. Number 13. Before this series examines systems, hierarchies, historical forces, before it explains anything, it needs to show you one image. A man climbing down into a hole. No oxygen, no protective suit. A rag across his face, a rope around his waist, and somewhere above him, a handful of men holding the other end. This is manual scavenging. More precisely, this is what happens when a sewage line blocks and no machine is coming, no municipal crew is dispatched, no engineer is consulted. A human being goes down instead. In India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, in any city where sanitation infrastructure exists mostly on paper, this is ordinary Tuesday morning work. The manhole cover comes off, the smell hits, and the man descends anyway, because his family needs to eat, because this is the only employment available to him, because in many cases this work has been assigned to his caste for generations he cannot count. In India, that caste lineage has a name and a history. Dalits, communities once classified as untouchable under a social order stretching back centuries, have been funneled into sanitation labour by a structure that made refusal economically equivalent to erasure. The organisation Safai Karmachari Andolan has documented what that structure produces: hundreds of deaths inside sewage chambers every year in India alone. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. The gases accumulate in enclosed spaces and they kill quickly, without warning, without drama. Official records frequently do not reflect this. Deaths get logged as accidents, or they do not get logged at all. The rope goes taut, then slack. Sometimes the man resurfaces unconscious. Sometimes he does not resurface. That is the image this series begins with, not a statistic, not a policy framework. A man at the edge of a concrete opening, the city moving around him as if nothing unusual is happening, because for everyone else, nothing is. Everything that follows, the systems, the choices, the historical weight pressing people toward moments like this one, starts here. Some of the documented deaths never happened underground. the worker was still standing above the opening when the gas reached them. That is where point 12, the approach, begins and ends. At the rim, before the descent, in the seconds when the body crosses a threshold, the mind has already crossed long before. Manual scavenging, the cleaning of sewers, septic pits and dry latrines by hand, has been illegal in India since 1993. The Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers Act was reinforced in 2013. And yet the Safai Karmachari Andolan, one of the principal organizations documenting this practice, estimates that hundreds of thousands of workers are still engaged in it today, most of them Dalit, inheritors of a caste logic that designated the handling of human waste as the task of those declared untouchable. The approach itself is a ritual. Barefoot or with cloth strips wound around the hands as the only protection, the worker moves toward the concrete manhole ring in the early morning, before the neighborhood wakes. The smell arrives well before the cover is lifted. Witnesses and journalists who have documented this practice consistently report the same adaptive behavior. Workers have learned to take short, shallow breaths through the mouth as they near the opening, a technique developed not consciously but through repetition as a way of blunting the body's instinctive recoil. What those who interviewed workers for Human Rights Watch and Safai Karmachari Andolan describe is a practiced psychological detachment. The men and women questioned used different words, switching off, going somewhere else, becoming blank, but the mechanism is the same: dissociation as a survival tool. The person approaching the pit is no longer fully present in the way a person standing on a pavement normally is. They have already moved past a line that has nothing to do with geography, and the physical danger is already live. Methane and hydrogen sulfide accumulate in enclosed sewer systems and are released in concentrated form the moment a cover is moved. Multiple documented fatalities have occurred at exactly this stage. The next point in this sequence examines what the worker carries with them into that space, and what the absence of proper equipment reveals about the system that sends them there. The most dangerous workplace in the world is often entered with less protection than a household cleaning job. That is not an exaggeration. That is point 11, the equipment. In the majority of documented cases across India, Bangladesh, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a manual scavenger descending into a septic tank or sewer shaft carries this: thin rubber gloves that tear on first contact with hardened deposits, plastic sandals or bare feet, and occasionally a strip of cloth wound around the face. The cloth stops nothing: not methane, not hydrogen sulfide, not ammonia. There is no oxygen supply, no gas detector, no rescue harness rated for extracting an unconscious adult from depth. There is a bucket with holes in it tied to a rope. There is a bamboo pole for breaking up years of compacted waste. That is the inventory. The visual effect is visceral. A close shot of gloved hands over an open manhole, the latex already splitting at the thumb, communicates what statistics cannot. The disproportion between the biological hazard below and the protection above it creates something close to a physical sensation in the viewer, a kind of helplessness by proxy. Now the harder question: why? The answer is not simply poverty. Equipment does exist: harnesses, gas monitors, breathing apparatus. These are manufactured, available, sometimes even procured. But contractors and property owners routinely fail to supply them, because doing so would implicitly acknowledge that this is labour deserving of protection. Acknowledging that is something the system has consistently refused to do. Where equipment does appear, in isolated municipal programmes, it tends to arrive broken, unmaintained, or unused. Workers lack training on the devices and know that raising concerns about safety means losing the day's pay. The gear sits beside the shaft. The man descends without it. This segment sets the terms for what comes next. The following frame is the descent itself. Most of the men who die cleaning septic pits do not die at the bottom. They die on the way down. That single fact reshapes everything we assume about what makes this work lethal. The descent, ranked 10th among the most dangerous occupational moments documented in manual scavenging research, refers to the act of a worker lowering himself, without mechanical extraction, into a sealed or semi-sealed pit holding years of accumulated human waste. The opening is often 50 to 60 centimeters wide. The depth ranges from 1.5 to 6 meters. There is no winch, no harness, no gas sensor. In India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, this is standard practice. The worker enters feet first, compresses his shoulders, and descends. Hydrogen sulfide, colorless, heavier than air, accumulating in the lowest layers of enclosed spaces, is already waiting. It paralyzes the olfactory nerve before the brain can register the smell. By the time the concentration is fatal, the worker has no sensation of danger. He loses consciousness, falls face forward into the waste, and drowns. The men watching from above see him stop moving. Some of them climb down to help. They die from the same gas within seconds. Multiple deaths in a single pit on a single day have been documented repeatedly by human rights organizations and investigative journalists across the region. The visual image is among the most quietly devastating in documentary filmmaking. A human silhouette narrowing into a dark aperture in the ground, a rope held by hands that may not be strong enough, a stillness that follows. No dramatic movement, no sound, just absence. The descent lasts seconds. Those seconds determine whether the man comes back. What he encounters at the bottom, if he survives the descent, is not simply filth. It is a biochemically active environment where gases, microorganisms, and decomposition chemistry combine into something that researchers have struggled to categorize outside the language of extremity. A person can die in a sewage tank before they have time to smell the danger. That is not a warning, that is the mechanism. Hydrogen sulfide, one of the gases produced by anaerobic bacteria living at the bottom of septic tanks and sewer reservoirs, paralyzes the olfactory receptors at lethal concentrations. The victim perceives nothing unusual. There is no odor, no signal, no moment of recognition. Death arrives without announcement, and that absence of warning is not incidental. It is a direct consequence of the chemistry involved. This is what makes the ecosystem below, ranked 9th among the most extreme documented working environments, so difficult to convey. The danger is invisible, odorless, and biologically self-sustaining. The bottom of a sewage tank is not an inert accumulation of waste. It is a functioning ecosystem that has been developing for months or years without light and without oxygen. Anaerobic bacteria thrive precisely in these conditions, and their metabolic activity continuously generates methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. Methane displaces the available oxygen and creates an explosive atmosphere. An open flame near such a site can trigger a detonation. The biological threat extends beyond gases. The liquid itself carries Escherichia coli, Salmonella, Vibrio cholerae, hepatitis A virus, and helminth eggs, all suspended in the same medium through which the diver moves. He works without protective equipment. Sometimes a thin cloth covers his face, often nothing does. Skin becomes the direct point of contact with each of these agents simultaneously. Observers who have documented this work describe the bottom layer as nearly solid from compacted sediment, with upper layers floating in various stages of decomposition. The diver operates blind, using his hands to locate blockages or deposits in total darkness. He cannot see what he touches. Everything this environment contains, the gases, the pathogens, the compressed biological matter, is present at once, without hierarchy or sequence. The diver enters it, works in it, and must then return to the surface carrying what he has been in contact with. What that extraction looks like and what follows it is where understanding of this profession deepens further. Most manual scavengers do not die inside the pit. They die next to it. That single fact reframes everything we think we know about the dangers of this work. The extraction phase, point 8 in the exposure sequence, is the moment the body settles its account with everything it absorbed underground. By the time a worker pulls himself over the rim of a septic tank or cesspit, the damage is already done. Skin saturated with fecal matter, mucous membranes exposed to ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, lungs that have drawn in methane vapor. The gases do not release their effect at the moment of contact. They delay it. Thousands of documented cases across India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan record the same pattern. A man climbs out, walks a few steps, and loses consciousness. According to Safai Karmachari Andolan, dozens of workers die in India every year in this post-ascent window. Not underground. On the surface, beside the pit they just cleaned. The reason the death toll remains this high is structural, not accidental. There is no decontamination, no clean water, no change of clothes. The worker wipes his hands on a rag if one is available and reaches for the next tool. The extracted material, a mixture of fecal sludge, construction debris, medical waste, and sometimes animal remains, is transferred into baskets or buckets by hand and carried out manually. It is frequently left at the roadside for hours with no collection service arriving. The worker travels home on foot or in crowded public transport, carrying pathogens on his skin and clothing into the spaces where his family lives. The body accumulates the damage across years: skin infections, chronic respiratory injury, hepatitis, typhoid. Each cycle adds another layer to a burden that never fully clears. This is not catastrophe in the conventional sense. It is attrition, systematic and slow, which is precisely why it remains invisible to the world outside. What this cycle does to a person's psychology is the next part of the story, and it is no less severe. Most of the men who enter sewage pits for a living cannot say their job title out loud in front of strangers. That single fact, documented by the NGOs Safety and Sanitation and Labour during field research in India in the 2000s, tells you more about this work than any physical description could. The contamination does not stay underground. Workers who regularly descend into the drainage systems of Mumbai, Dhaka, and Karachi carry something back to the surface that no amount of scrubbing removes. Sociologists and physicians who have worked in the informal settlements of India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan have documented a pattern of psychological damage that closely resembles chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. Intrusive imagery, broken sleep, a persistent and irrational sense of being permanently soiled. The social architecture around these workers reinforces every symptom. Neighbours pull back. Children in the neighbourhood grow up knowing what the man at the end of the street does for work. Inside the family home, the worker is often asked to wash separately, to eat from separate plates. He returns from the pit into a world that looks straight through him. Alcohol enters this picture not as a personal failing, but as an occupational coping mechanism. Workers in all three cities describe the same ritual: a glass of cheap spirits or homemade liquor before the descent. The stated reasons are consistent: to blunt the smell, to make entry possible, to stop thinking. Employers quietly accept the practice, some encourage it. A drunk worker asks fewer questions and turns down fewer assignments. Over years, the dependency compounds and accelerates the physical deterioration already underway. The visual grammar of this chapter is not pipes or waste, it is faces. Empty eyes on a man who has just climbed back up. A glass held in both hands. A wall that someone leans against before walking home. This psychological erosion forms the foundation for what prolonged exposure does to the body itself. A man can drown in a dry sewer, not in water, in gas. Hydrogen sulfide accumulates in the lower sections of sewage pipes, invisible and almost odorless at lethal concentrations, and it kills not by suffocation, but by shutting down the cell's ability to use oxygen at all. The body has air. The body cannot breathe. That is point 6, the systematic destruction of the body. And it is not rhetoric. It is a medical classification that took decades of NGO fieldwork to even partially document. The damage operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Hydrogen sulfide attacks the respiratory tract and the mucous membranes of the eyes and nose on every descent. Chronic inhalation of methane and ammonia produces irreversible scarring of lung tissue, the kind of damage seen in coal miners, not sanitation workers who officially did not exist in any labour registry. Manual sanitation workers in India coughed blood. Their vision deteriorated year by year. Their joints broke down from hours spent contorted inside pipes too narrow to straighten a spine. Through skin and mucous membranes, the sewage delivered a second assault: cholera, hepatitis A, leptospirosis, typhoid fever, intestinal parasites. No ingestion required. Immersion was enough. NGOs operating in Mumbai and Delhi from the late 1990s through the 2010s compiled what official health statistics did not. The average life expectancy of a manual scavenger was dramatically below the national average, frequently under 50 years. Emergency physicians who treated these workers faced a bureaucratic paradox. They could observe the cause of death clearly, but had no official occupational category to record it against. Families were sometimes told only that the cause was unknown. Skin ulcers, nails that split and fell away, lungs visible in X-rays as opaque fields of scar tissue. Medical records and dermatological photographs form the visual core of this segment, evidence that the body kept the account even when the state refused to. Which leads directly to the question that follows. If the destruction is this certain, this documented, this visible, why does a person keep going down? The answer lies in an economic trap that offers almost no exit. A man can spend his entire working life descending into sewers and never once appear in a labour record. That is not an oversight. That is the system functioning exactly as it was built. Point 5 is the economic trap, and it is the most efficient mechanism keeping manual scavengers locked into this work across India and the global south. More effective than any law, any threat, any wall. The numbers are precise and devastating. Workers receive between $1 and $3 per descent into a sewer or septic tank. A single workday can involve multiple descents. The total earned barely covers basic food costs for a household. Yet the work is formally illegal in many countries, which means it generates no contract, no registration, no sick pay, no insurance, no pension. The illegality that was meant to end the practice instead stripped it of every protection that might make it survivable. Debt is the mechanism that locks the trap shut. Labour contractors advance money to workers before the job begins. The worker, with no savings and no alternative income, accepts. That advance becomes an obligation paid back in labour. When illness, injury, or simple arithmetic makes repayment impossible, the worker takes another advance. The loop tightens. Children inherit the outstanding balances of their fathers. Entire families find themselves bound across generations to a single contractor, a single district, a single economic relationship with no exit clause. The structural reasons for that absence of exit are not abstract. Escaping requires education, recognized identity documents, social connections outside one's caste community, and capital for relocation. Workers inside this system typically have none of these. The trap is not a metaphor. It is a precise configuration of material conditions in which every direction toward the outside has been closed off, not by malice in any single decision, but by the accumulated weight of poverty, caste, legal exclusion, and debt compounding across time. The visual language for this section is deliberately plain. Coins on a dirty palm, handwritten debt receipts, market price boards, arithmetic that does not balance. No dramatization is needed. The numbers carry the argument. And they also carry the logic that leads directly to point 6. When economic entrapment is complete, the body becomes the only remaining resource. So the body is what gets spent. More than 1,000 people died cleaning sewers in India between 2010 and 2023, in a country where that work had been illegal since 1993. That gap between a law written and a law enforced is the story of how prohibition becomes performance. India's Manual Scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act criminalized the manual cleaning of sewers and septic tanks 3 decades ago. Fines were specified. Criminal liability was established. Yet data compiled by the Safai Karmachari Andolan across the following decade showed that hundreds of thousands of workers continued to do precisely that job, by hand, without protective equipment, without any of the machinery the law implicitly demanded. The legislation existed. The practice never stopped. The reasons are structural, not accidental. Local municipalities across India rely on cheap, unprotected labour to maintain sanitation infrastructure that formal systems cannot or will not service. Contractors outsource to subcontractors, who outsource again, until, by the time a worker descends into a manhole, there is no traceable chain of official accountability left. Labour inspectors are overstretched, susceptible to corruption, or simply absent. Workers themselves almost never file complaints, because filing a complaint means risking the only income available to them, and because experience teaches that complaints produce nothing. The Supreme Court of India issued directives on multiple occasions demanding full eradication of the practice. The government submitted progress reports. The figures in those reports diverged substantially from what field organisations were documenting. The National Commission for Safai Karmachari recorded more than 1,000 fatalities in sewer and septic tank cleaning between 2010 and 2023, figures that capture only confirmed deaths, not the unreported ones that leave no paper trail. The contrast is stark and precise. An official government document bearing a state emblem, printed with the language of prohibition, and an open pit in a residential courtyard where a man without gloves or a mask begins his workday. The law looked away, and into that silence moved something older than any statute, a system that had already assigned these men their place before they were born. Number 3. Caste, stigma, and social exclusion. There is a man in this story who wakes before dawn, walks to a manhole in a city of millions, and disappears into it. By midday, he is back on the street. By evening, he is invisible in a different way, not underground, but unreachable. The temple door is not locked. It simply does not open for him. This is not incidental. It is architectural. The overwhelming majority of manual scavengers in India are Dalits, the people once formally classified as untouchable, assigned across generations to occupations that caste society deemed too impure for anyone else to perform. The labour did not create the stigma created the labour. And then the labour confirmed the stigma in a loop that has been running for centuries. What makes it structural rather than personal is the way it operates on every surface at once. The International Labour Organization and Indian civil society organizations document that the social exclusion of sewer workers is not a matter of individual prejudice, it is systemic. A worker's children may be quietly pushed to the back of a classroom. His touch on a shared vessel can be treated in some rural communities as contamination. A separate plate, a separate space. The boundary maintained not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of habit. And that is precisely what traps people inside it. Even when someone wants to leave this work, caste follows them into the formal economy. It surfaces in a surname, in an address, in the texture of an accent. Employers in the organized sector close doors that are never formally described as closed. Banks require collateral that does not exist. The exit is visible from a distance. Up close, it is a wall. The camera does not need to follow this man underground to tell this part of the story.
It finds him on the surface, in the way a crowd parts around him without looking, in the exhaustion and dignity that occupy his face at the same time, in the separate plate left at the edge of a table. The society that uses him knows he exists, which raises the only question left. If the law also knows, and it does, why has it not changed anything? That gap between statute and reality is where the next part of this story begins. In India, it is still legal to die cleaning sewers with your bare hands. Decades after manual scavenging was first banned, workers continue to descend into sewage drains without equipment, without protection, and without any realistic prospect of legal recourse. What makes this fact more disturbing is not the policy failure alone. It is that thousands of people have fought back against it, loudly and persistently, and the system has largely refused to listen.
Organizations like Safai Karmachari Andolan have spent years doing the work the state will not. Recording deaths, filing lawsuits, forcing public hearings. Their activists are not outside observers. Many are former manual scavengers themselves, people who entered those drains and survived, and who now carry photographs of those who did not. They stand in public spaces and say names out loud. They demand that specific officials answer for specific deaths. This is accountability work conducted by the people with the most at stake and the least institutional power. The resilience runs deeper than organized protest. Inside affected communities, informal networks distribute survival knowledge, how to reduce exposure, how to recognize warning signs, which chemicals are most dangerous in confined spaces. When a worker dies, the community organizes collective mourning so that no family faces that loss in isolation. These are not small gestures. They are the architecture of dignity, built in the spaces the state has abandoned. And yet every individual act of courage meets the same structural ceiling. Caste hierarchies, legal impunity, and economic desperation form a system that regenerates itself regardless of individual resistance. The fact that this resistance exists at all is evidence that the problem never quietly dissolved. People have been naming it for decades. That the structures remain largely intact is not a failure of human spirit. It is a question directed at everyone who has chosen not to look. India banned manual scavenging in 1993, then banned it again in 2013 because the first law changed nothing. Even after two prohibitions spanning 2 decades, the Safai Karmachari Andolan documented hundreds of thousands of people still doing exactly that work, not as a remnant of the past, but as a functioning, present-tense arrangement. That is not policy failure. That is policy revealing preference. The reason is not infrastructure lag or budget shortfall, though those are real. The reason is that a body willing to descend into a sewer is cheaper than a machine, and in economies where some lives are priced accordingly, the math never changes. Every 5 days, a worker dies inside a manhole in India. Official figures. Rights organizations estimate the actual toll is substantially higher, and India is simply the most documented instance of something that operates identically in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and across sub-Saharan Africa. Wherever urbanization has outpaced sanitation investment, the solution has been consistent. The bottom of the system is always a human being. The glass towers of Mumbai, Karachi, and Nairobi are not abstractions here. Their sewage infrastructure runs literally beneath their financial districts, and the people who clean it by hand are cleaning the physical foundations of skylines that photograph well from a distance.
This documentary has shown you the bodies consumed by disease, the families living beside open waste, the children inheriting a caste position that no law has successfully dissolved. What it is asking now is that you call what you have seen by its correct name. Not tragedy, not underdevelopment, an indictment, a specific, deliberate charge against a global order that continues in the 21st century to choose human bodies as its cheapest waste management instrument. Choice is the operative word. The machinery exists, the economics are manageable. What is missing is the decision that certain lives are not available for that calculation. If this is a system, the question that follows is unavoidable. Who, if anyone, is refusing it? In India, manually cleaning human waste from sewage pits is illegal. In India, it happens every single day. That is not a contradiction to be resolved. That is the system working exactly as designed. Manual scavenging, the practice of descending into septic tanks, sewage wells, and open drains without mechanical equipment or protective gear, continues across India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan at a scale that defies the legislation written to end it. The Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers Act has existed in India since 2013. Convictions under that law remain vanishingly rare. The gap between the text of the statute and its enforcement is not bureaucratic failure. It is a political choice repeated daily by omission. The physical reality of descent is this: a rope, bare hands, and an atmosphere in which methane and hydrogen sulfide concentrations can exceed lethal thresholds within minutes. No ventilation, no gas detection equipment, no rescue protocol. Workers who lose consciousness at the bottom of a pit are frequently retrieved only after they are already dead. In many recorded cases, family members who climbed in to help died alongside them. The population performing this work is not random. It is drawn almost exclusively from Dalit communities, specifically from castes historically designated for sanitation labour under the caste hierarchy. This is not coincidence. It is the operational logic of a system that pairs social stigma with economic desperation to ensure a reliable supply of workers for work that the rest of society refuses to acknowledge as work at all. Chronic skin infections, pulmonary damage, gastrointestinal disease, and drastically reduced life expectancy are the documented physical outcomes. Alcohol dependency is widespread, not as a cultural pathology, but as the only available painkiller for people who have no access to occupational health care. Every death in a sewage pit has a cause. The cause is not gas. The cause is the decision not to provide equipment, not to enforce law, not to invest in mechanized alternatives. Globally, the infrastructure of comfort, the sewage systems, the clean streets, the functioning plumbing, depends on labour that is made deliberately invisible. This is not a problem of the global south. This is the logic of any system that decides, without stating it aloud, whose lives are expendable.